Let's talk about the He Gets Us Super Bowl commercial.
All right, let's see it. And also, what up, party people?
Came on TV last night while we were watching the Super Bowl, and immediately my friend and I looked at each other and said, this doesn't feel like God. And while yes, it paints a beautiful message, it's not a biblical one.
It's just as biblical a message as any other, as long as we're understanding biblical message to refer to a message that is inspired by and constructed upon a foundation of passages from the Bible. If one wants to understand a biblical message to refer to a message that is represented in a univocal, consistent, and single way from beginning to end throughout the Bible, then there's no such thing as a biblical message, at least not a message that has any social salience or value today. As the Bible is not univocal, it's a collection of numerous different voices that are saying different things in different times, in different places, in different languages to different people for different reasons. And when we try to force it to say the same thing, to be univocal, that is us imposing an entirely non-biblical unifying framework upon the Bible so that it says what we need it to say. And that process of negotiation always involves centering and prioritizing certain passages that say what we need it to say, and then marginalizing, ignoring, or reinterpreting the passages that don't say what we need it to say. So all biblical messages are negotiated between our contexts and circumstances and rhetorical needs and exigencies today and the texts of the Bible. Nobody has any choice except to engage in that process of negotiation. And I would argue that the only real questions are, what are our motivations and goals for doing this, and whose interests are being prioritized?
Jesus did not wash everyone's feet. He washed his disciples' feet.
So the commercial is not depicting Jesus washing anyone's feet. The commercial is depicting people washing each other's feet, an act of service that could very well be considered a fulfillment of Jesus' command to his disciples in John 13 to wash one another's feet. And we don't know who in the commercial is Christian and who is not. There's only one example from that commercial of a couple that appears not to be Christian, and that's the Muslim couple who are having their feet washed by another couple who we're assuming is Christian. But nothing precludes anyone else in that commercial from being Christian. There might be people you don't want to think of as Christian, but that would just be engaging in boundary maintenance to try to restrict who our neighbors are. And I think one of the main points of the commercial is to point out that these are all our neighbors, and it is very much a biblical message that we need to expand the fence around our neighbors rather than restrict them. That's certainly something that Jesus says in the New Testament, and I'm unaware of any passage that could plausibly be leveraged to overrule the parable of the Good Samaritan and the insistence that everyone is our neighbor.
Who picked up their crosses and turned from their sin.
So Jesus had not yet been crucified by John 13. It wouldn't happen until multiple chapters later, and so the disciples didn't even understand the significance of the cross and certainly could not have picked it up or turned from their sins. That is something that the Gospel of John describes as a post-resurrection reality. They still had a lot of things to go through yet, and they still had Judas, whose feet were washed, who would be the one who turned Jesus over. So no, Jesus is not washing the feet of those who had already turned from their sin. And again, we're talking about a commercial that depicts people washing other people's feet. And so this false claim is just trying to restrict the scope of our responsibility to serve. And that would be precisely what the people who sneered at Jesus, "Who is my neighbor?" were trying to do.
And look, we are all broken, we've all fallen short, and we have all made mistakes. But the picture that the He Gets Us movement is showing is of lukewarm Christians who would rather paint their own picture of Jesus than turn from their sin.
So when it comes to Jesus, there are two and only two options. You either paint your own Jesus, or you accept the Jesus that has been painted for you by somebody else. because the Bible doesn't present a single unified and consistent profile of Jesus. It presents multiple different profiles that are each internally inconsistent. So we have to take pieces from those and construct our own single Jesus. And overwhelmingly what people do today is combine the two. They accept the Jesus that has been painted for them by others, and then they touch it up along the way to respond to situationally emergent needs and exigencies. Far too many Christians today are accepting a Jesus that has been very carefully and very intentionally crafted over the course of many years so as to structure power, values, and boundaries in favor of social dominance orientation, Christian nationalism, right-wing authoritarianism, militant masculinity, and directly over and against the interests of the minoritized, the marginalized, the vulnerable, the poor, the needy, the oppressed. And they do this because that Jesus has been carefully crafted so as to resonate with people's identity politics today. So it feels right and it makes sense. And because most people don't like to think critically about their identity politics, they just blithely accept it and then go on to defend people who are just trying to structure political power. So when people talk about turning from sin and being separated from the world, they are overwhelmingly serving the interests of the world, and they don't even know it. And let's look at this commercial. There are 12 different groups of people that are represented, but there are only 2 that get brought up. It is the older woman who's washing the feet of the younger woman in front of the abortion clinic, and it is the priest washing the feet of the queer-presenting person. So, gays and abortion, those are the 2 issues that are focused on, to the exclusion of the other 10 groups that are mentioned in this commercial. And what do those 2 things have in common? They're both identity markers that have been generated over the course of many generations so as to structure power and values in favor of the people doing the painting.
They're choosing the world over the gospel. They're choosing their sin over sanctification. They're choosing to partake in this world rather than be separated from it. Jesus did not come to this earth to make friends. He came to share the gospel, the truth, and do it boldly and unapologetically. Jesus came to lead people to eternal freedom. Yes, the Bible tells us to love. Yes, Jesus asks us to forgive, but what he doesn't do is command us to condone a life that glorifies sin.
So the message here, by saying Jesus never commanded us to do X, which means Jesus commands us not to do X, seems to be that Jesus doesn't want us to serve certain people because doing so might be interpreted as condoning their lifestyle by other people, which is just another way to sneer, why does your master eat with tax collectors and sinners?
This New Age spirituality is painting a false narrative of the kingdom of God in the name of political gain.
Once again, I need to bring this back to the fact that the only 2 issues here are identity markers that are salient today only because they serve the interests of political gain.
Not everyone who says they're a Christian will get into heaven, and that is a terrifying reality. We will hear one of 2 things at the end of our life. Well done, my good and faithful servant, or depart from me, I never knew you. We are called to be in this world, but not of it. You cannot have your sin and also walk the straight and narrow path. Yes, Jesus gets us, but he would never willingly dine in our sin. He would lovingly call us out of it.
If you have accepted or are curating a Jesus that was painted for you by others, who insist that your salvation is contingent upon your accurately distinguishing those neighbors who are worthy of your service from those neighbors who are not worthy of your service, and that distinction happens to line up conveniently with the right-wing authoritarian and social dominance orientation identity markers that are being leveraged by politicians today to structure power and values and boundaries in their own favor, maybe think a little more critically about where your Jesus came from.